So thank you so much, Brie, for coming onto our podcast. Our audience is going to get so much value just by you being on because you're like an awesome person and
Thank
you've
you.
done so much. So the first question that we want to get into is like, what is your story? How did you get into real estate and business?
So I started in real estate when I was 17, actually. My parents were getting divorced. We had an agent over selling our house, and she was sitting at our kitchen table, and I just started chatting with her. And she had told me, you're destined to be in real estate. So at the time, I was a senior in high school. I thought about it. Sounded like an awesome career. I skipped going to college because I was going to become a real estate agent and get licensed. So Illinois law, it used to be 18, but now the law had changed, so you got to be 21. So I waited till I was 21, took my classes, got licensed like the day I turned 21, and lasted about 9 months before I quit. I absolutely hated it. Um, Being an agent, like on the retail side of things, I hated being an agent. It was really hard for me to get people to trust me at 21 years old. You're trying to convince someone that buying this house is a great idea. And what experience do you really have at 21 years old? So that was really difficult. Secondly, I found I didn't communicate very well with them. I was talking about things like cost per square footage, and like value add things, and they were talking about how it makes them feel in paint colors. So I didn't last very long, I think, and I went into corporate advertising sales. But again, I had already gone through the schooling of getting licensed, and in my first sales job ever, I said I was 22 years old. Our CEO or our VP used to start every Monday morning meeting saying, "Congratulations, you have a job for 30 days." That's how he started his meetings, because it was a very cutthroat business. If you missed your quota more than 1 month, you were fired. That was the end of it. So I always kept my license active and renewed it every year on the off chance, like, hey, if I ever get fired, at least I can go become a leasing agent, or go back into real estate at some point. But I really had no plans to ever do that. Went on with my life. About 9 years had passed. And then when my first husband and we were just about to get engaged, we were talking about, rings and weddings and babies and the whole life path you're supposed to take.
Yeah.
And, part of that path is, buying a home, American dream. And we live in Chicago and things are very expensive. So we were like, well, it's going to take us years and years to be able to afford buying a single family home in this market. We don't need that space right now. So we had looked at doing a 3-flat, where we could, our thoughts were we bought a 3-flat in 2011. We would live in one unit for now, which is the two of us. And then as we needed space, we can always remove some doors and then we can take over the first floor. And then as we needed more space, we could always remove some walls and doors, then go into the basement. And then eventually we would have our single family house, but it would be paid for the majority of the time by tenants over the first, 5-10 years until we needed that space. So that's how it started.
That
Nice.
is awesome. And you touched on a lot of things there. And we kind of like to try to cater to the younger entrepreneurs who's like just getting started, as well as some people who already have some experience. So kind of tailoring some of this message to our younger listeners and viewers. Um, you said there was kind of a language barrier when you started in real estate. You started as an agent, and there was that language barrier of you're talking about cost of square foot and value add things, and they're talking about emotion. Can you expand on that a little bit and talk about why? Because I feel like you were probably born to be an investor, and the agent said you were born to be in real estate, so you just went through this traditional path of agent when you were really probably destined to be an investor.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, again, as you get older, one of the things that you learn is to be self-aware, right? And self-aware is learning to reflect on yourself, your skills, and part of that is learning what you're good at and not good at. And it evolves over time. It's really interesting. But at 21, I was just not self-aware. I was aware that I could drink legally, and that there was a beach in Chicago. Those were like my two biggest things that took over the first couple years of my 20s. But yeah, now that I'm like as an adult, it's interesting looking back and that explains the reason why I hated it. because
Yeah.
we were talking, he said my communication and their communication, we were missing each other. So I wasn't able to level with them on things that they understood, nor were they understanding things that I was talking about. So like that they would pass up a house that was, you know, a much better value per se, because it didn't feel like home, and like I just couldn't grasp those concepts. You know, even now it's hard for me when I do have clients that are more on like the retail side of things, that I have a great client. You know, it was a referral through a friend of a friend, and you know, he's selling this beautiful condo down in River North, and he's looking for these multi-million-dollar houses in Lincoln Park. And when, you know, I went for the listing appointment, and one of the first things I said to him was like, listen, if you want to talk about how things make you feel, I'm going to nod my head, I'm going to smile really pretty, and my eyes are going to completely glass over, right? But if you want to talk about like, hey, like I know building code, I know construction code, right? If you want to talk about what you could do with this property, where the structural walls are, how you can move this and make it your own, how you can add square footage to the lot size, like I am your girl. If you want to talk like numbers and logic and reasoning, like I am your girl. Like I'm like, you know, you could talk to me about those things, but like, I'm being honest. I'm not. If you're looking for the pretty girl who brings champagne to your showing, you know, like it's just not me. And he hired me, you know, but like, you just got to be upfront. I'm not going to, I know exactly who I am. I know who I work well with, and too old at this point to work with people that we're not on the same page is what it comes down to.
True. So I also want to dig into that transition from we're going to live in this 3 flat and then rent the other 2 units out to being someone who owns, I think, a little bit under like 100 units. Because for a lot of people, they're like, okay, how did I get from, you know, this place, or how do I get from this place to having probably a multi-million-dollar portfolio?
So it wasn't the plan. I can tell you that. It wasn't the plan. So we bought the house in August of 2011. And then it was like 3 weeks later was my dad's 60th birthday. We rented a boat. We went on Lake Michigan for the Air and Water Show. You know, we had a great day in Chicago. And then about 6 weeks later, he got a very aggressive form of cancer diagnosis. And within 9 months, he had passed away after 13 rounds of chemo and 10 rounds of radiation. And he had literally died the day before he was supposed to retire. And that really just messed with me, because the retirement party that we had planned for him ended up being his memorial service. And it, you know, he always talked about, when I retire, I'm going to go do this. And when I retire, I'm going to go travel the world, and I'm going to go to Thailand, and I'm going to do all these cool things. And it was always, well, after your brother finishes grad school, or after you get married, I'm going to retire. And fucking life just took it right out of from underneath him, you know? Yeah. And that just really, really resonated with me of like, well, here I am. I've got a great job. I actually loved my job. I wasn't one of those people that like hated going to work. I had a fantastic job at a fantastic company that I'd spent 9 years building my career. But it was like, well, where is this going? Right. I get my 2 weeks vacation every year, which I can't take at the same time, you know, because God forbid you're actually out of pocket for more than 3 days at a time.
Yeah.
And even when I'm on vacation, I can't really be on vacation. I'm expected to be available. You know, and that's great. Like I said, I want to move up the corporate ladder, get into, you know, management, want to become a female executive someday, but at what cost? Like I was working, you know, 60 hours a week. I was traveling the country. I've been traveling for about 7 years at that point, you know, and like half my life was airports. And when you can name like about 30 airport codes off the top of your head, like, you know, you've got a problem.
That's nuts.
You know, so it really became an issue of like, we need to rethink our life plan. And at that point we'd owned our property for almost a year. And we looked at, my husband and I sat down and looked at, you know, what are our goals? What do we want and how do we get there? So that we looked at even learning to code. That was one of the things that we looked at, those boot camps you can go to. Like we can code from a beach in Thailand, you know, so like maybe you quit your job, you go code. And then once you get established, then I'll quit my, like, that's what we were trying to work towards. But obviously real estate was one of the options too. So again, it wasn't really intentional. It was like, well, let's start looking at maybe another property. Like this could work as well. So we ended up buying our next property a few months later. And then our third property we bought was kind of an accident. It was a personal residence for us, but what it did was it was a original like 1970s, had not been touched. It was an estate sale. We bought it and we rehabbed it, and after 6 months, we were able to pull equity out of it. And then that put us in a really interesting position of, hey, we've got this capital, we weren't really sold in the whole real estate thing per se, but now we've got capital to invest. Maybe this is the path that we go. So it quickly spiraled from there, and then it became what it has become today.
That is absolutely awesome. So you talked about that, just to reiterate kind of your story, your father had passed away right before retirement, and you had that jolt, knowing that you had to get freedom just somehow, some way, and you had to live your life, because life is, fragile, and it could be very, very short at times. Can you kind of talk about, I know at John's meetup, you talked about how, you kind of bought like a ton of properties, like it started to snowball, and it started to snowball really, really quickly, that you went from using your own capital to starting to raise capital for these different acquisitions. Can you talk about the kind of the time frame in which that happened and why that kind of happened?
Sure. Yeah. I said the original plan was always that we were going to continue to work for a few years until the properties were paid off. So like we're assuming between 10 and 15 years is how long it would take if we took all the cash flow and we put it back into the properties. That's how long it would take and then we could retire. But that plan changed, as most plans do. So the first set of properties, so the first 21 properties I own myself, without any sort of partners. The first, the last 8. So the first 23, whatever, came from personal capital that we had. And then I borrowed money from my brother to buy the last 8. So he had owned his house free and clear. I had convinced him, because he's awesome, to put a loan on his house for me and then give me the money. And then I'd pay him back with interest after 18 months. So that was our deal. And I was able to, again, use all the cash flow that we'd been generating to pay him back his capital. And then I just started working with investors. So I bought my first property in July of 2014 on my own in Milwaukee. By May of 2015, which is about 9 months later, I had acquired 18 properties on my own. And then I started working with investors starting in June. Between June and September, we acquired another 8 properties. So it was a quite aggressive growth year.
Definitely. Yeah. And that's really awesome. I want to get into a little bit of that working with investors, because a lot of people have been approaching us lately, asking us, how do you raise capital for acquisitions? Because we had to start off doing that because we had no money. But, how do you raise capital? And it's like this fear that goes along with it. And I just want to know, as an investor, have you ever had that fear? And if so, how did you overcome it?
So I actually have never raised capital. So my partners are a little bit different, where they approached me and sought me out and said, hey, I've been reading about what you're doing. I've been kind of following your story. If the opportunity ever presents itself, I would like to work with you.
Okay.
So that's how the conversation started. And it started before I ever even bought a property in Milwaukee. So my partner, I have 3 partners. We all own properties together in Milwaukee. But my point to them was, I can see where this goes, but I'm not ready right now to take on any sort of partners. We have our own personal goals that I'm focused on, but I'd be happy to continue conversations with you. And then we can see what happens. So 2 of the partners, I said, I met probably March, April of 2017 or 2015, right? No, 2014, before I'd ever acquired a property. So what I'd done was every month I essentially sent them over a recap of what had happened. Like, hey, I looked at 30 properties this month. Here's the ones I made offers on. Here's why I made offers on them. Here's the price that I offered and why. Here's the ones I passed on. Here's why I passed on them. And then that grew into, hey, we just bought, 18 units this month. We had 3 tenants who moved out in the middle of the night. before we even got a chance to talk to them. Here's how I handled it. Here's how things are going with my property manager. So that went on for about a year with those two partners. And then they would write back questions, like, oh, why did you do this? And it really developed a long-term relationship. So when we went to go, by the time I was done buying for myself, that's what I told them. I wanted to wait till I was done buying for myself. I didn't want ever to compete with them. Nor did I ever want them to feel that like, hey, Brie's taking the good stuff and then giving us the leftovers.
Yeah.
So that was part of the conversation, was getting them up to that point. About halfway through that process, a third partner had approached me. I was speaking at an event in San Francisco. He lived in the area. He wanted to start talking with me about becoming a partner. He flew out, I think a few months later. We went and looked at some of my properties. Again, told him I wasn't ready. But then we started that same sort of process. So the three of them don't know each other. So how we would set things up is we have individual LLCs. So it's a 2-person LLC with each individual owner. They control the acquisition amounts, right? I run the day-to-days, but it's whatever they're comfortable with. So I like it that way personally because I can manage each relationship individually. I can manage expectations individually. And if one person if things go south with one partner, the other ones are completely intact and separate. But that's how that started. And it's been great. It's been a couple of years now. My partners are really not very involved. I run the business. I send them a report every month. Maybe once a quarter, they respond with a question. Most of our conversations are social at this point. But that came off the basis of them getting in my head, right? Because when something happens, I don't want to call them for their permission. Every single time something comes up, I should be able to make a decision. But at that point too, I also don't want to be second guessed, or have to explain myself. So they really need to know me. So that's I'm a huge advocate of that sort of process. And the partner that we were only with for maybe 6 months, was a much rockier start because we were, I would do something and then it was like, well, why did we evict this tenant? And then I'd go back and explain my process again, so it was different. So that's my recommendation for it. People need to understand that you're dealing with someone else's money. That's an incredible responsibility. Losing my money is one thing, I can just say, well, my bad, I messed up, my fault. But losing someone else's money, right? Like that's just not acceptable.
Right.
And so it takes an extra layer of responsibility, I feel.
Yeah, definitely.
And I really like how everything pretty much just flows. Like, it just sounds like opportunity after opportunity really just flows into like your life, and you don't really force anything, because some people, like, they try to force getting into real estate and like they force raising capital, but really like you just kind of went with the flow. So I really like that.
It's been, you mentioned that. So I quit my job. Like, I bought my first properties. I quit my job right then. The first ones I bought in Milwaukee. And I will mention though, my lender had told me that me leaving my job was not going to affect my ability to grow. So that was the big piece of the puzzle. But I would tell the story of like, I quit my job and I was like, I'm going to be one of those like chill people that just like reads books in cafes at like 2:00 on a Tuesday. Right. I'm not that person at all. Yeah. Like none of like, I've actually started 6 businesses. I've got 6 new LLCs since that day, with 4 different business streams that were completely unintentional. It just happened. I had time in my schedule. So that's I bought my first set of properties. I anticipated that my time was going to be spent up in Milwaukee, getting the business set up, doing all that stuff. But I had a day-to-day manager. So after a month or so, I figured out that like, I thought I was going to need to be up there 40 hours a week. Realistically, I'm up there maybe 10 hours a week. Like, now what am I going to do with my time? I'm not a chill person who can just work 10 hours a week. And then, I was at a meetup, and one of this guy had approached me and said, I'm really struggling with finding an agent that can talk real estate, right? They can talk like retail stuff, but they can't talk investor stuff. Can you teach me? I'm like, well, technically I'm licensed. I've been licensed for over 10 years. I've just never taken on clients because they suck. So, I don't like them is what I told him. But like, maybe the investor side would be more fun for me. I didn't have a car. So this guy would come pick me up and we would go look at houses. And now I'm one of the top 10% agents in Chicago. I've got a full service brokerage company with 4 agents that work underneath me. That was not part of the plan either. That just happened, through that, like, I've got time, like, why not? Let's try it, and it just flowed, into those things. So I find when you leave your options open, you leave your mind open, opportunities do come your way.
Yeah. And then you have the opportunity to be accidentally awesome, as I call it. So
it just happened. Like I said, looking back, it's been really weird. People always ask me in these podcasts, what's your goal in the next 7 years? I'm like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Like things have, like, if you asked me 7 years ago what my goal, I think, was to buy 4 properties and then stop working when I'm 50. That was my goal. Quit corporate when I'm 50 and have 4 properties. And that has drastically changed. So it's always evolving.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I think you're right. If you try to force it, right, people have this, this hard written plan in mind. You've got to do it this way. You've got to do it like this. And that's not always true. You get yourself into trouble a lot too, I think, that way. Especially with buying investment properties. If your goal is to buy 1 a quarter, well, what happens if there's no good properties that quarter? Are you just going to buy something to buy it because that's your goal? Now you're buying a property that's not profitable, or that you probably shouldn't have bought because you're trying to hit your goals. And like, that's where it starts getting, like, it's starting to get forced.
Yeah. And like I said, a lot of people, they have a lot of these kind of fears of failure or even success. And I kind of wanted to know, is there anything in your entire career that you were like kind of afraid of, like an obstacle or a challenge, and that you had to look at that and, figure out how you were going to attack it?
It's an interesting question. I don't know how my parents raised me, but I was raised really with like no fear or social filters as well.
Yeah.
So like, I don't know what they did. But that's never been an issue for me. But again, a lot of it really comes down to, at least in my opinion, when you go through something as traumatic as losing your dad, who was like I was totally daddy's girl. Everything else seems like not a problem, to be perfectly honest. Like I've had people start fires in my buildings. I've had people run their cars into my buildings. Like all this shit. Like, and really at the end of the day, comparing those two things, it is not a comparison. So you just got to learn to, like, get over the fear. Like, it is what it is. I've got a very, I don't know if you want to say maybe holistic approach on life. That what will happen, right? And you can't control the things that can happen to you. All you can control is your reactions to things. And, think of it as a learning lesson. If you look at everything bad as a learning opportunity, it becomes a positive.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So another question I wanted to ask is kind of a question that John asked at his meetup. And I found it very, very interesting because I never really thought about the reason behind it. But why do you prefer small multifamily properties over like the much larger multifamily properties? And the reason I ask that is because in my career, I always wanted to get into the larger stuff. But then when I heard your reasoning behind some of the smaller stuff, and it's like, maybe I probably need to mix this up a little bit. And I think our audience would love to hear why a lot of times, in some instances, small multifamily could be a lot more scalable and a lot easier to handle than the larger stuff.
Sure. There's a couple of reasons. With syndication, right? With syndications, typically, larger, 50 plus unit properties. To me, it was a lack of control, right? That's why I never liked getting into that kind of stuff. Is typically I wasn't the one, at that point when I was buying properties, I was not ready to take on investors' money to buy a 50 unit. I was not experienced enough. I was not mature enough. And I was not probably diligent enough to start dealing with people's money when I first started. So that was part of it. B, as an investor, for me to invest in a syndication, I don't like the lack of control, right? I like to really understand, what my moves are and then be able to control it. That's even why my partnerships are all one-on-one. So that I still have more control, or I have, if one relationship goes bad, it's not controlling or not involved with the other ones. But when it comes to the under 50 market, right, and I'm comparing them to 2 to 4 units, one of the things I always looked at was what's the cap rate of the property, right? And your cap rate is your net operating expenses divided by the purchase price of the property. But what I found was, especially if the under 20 units, was that, if you have, let's say you have a duplex next to a 10 unit, right? And they're same quality units, they're all 2 bedrooms, the rents are going to be the same, right? They're essentially the same building. But the expenses are drastically different. Once you get into the 5+ world, you're dealing with commercial loans, which are more expensive. Commercial insurance is more expensive. In the city of Chicago and the city of Milwaukee, you have to pay for your own trash service, your own recycling service. It's not included in your tax bill. Now you've also got to have common utilities as well. So when I'm looking at it, let's say each unit brings in $1,300 a month, the expenses are actually quite drastically different. So my expenses in that 10 unit are actually almost double my expenses in the other unit. So I find until you get to about 20, 25 units, then those would balance out where they're being equal. So why would I take a lower cap rate? It's less profitable for me to buy a 20 unit when I can buy 10 duplexes. That also gives me additional exit strategies. So the big thing the last couple of years has been house hacking. I'm sure you've heard that term, right?
Yeah.
So it's the easiest way to get started for an investor. An investor can't house hack a 20 unit. An investor can't house hack a 5 unit.
Right.
It's not allowed. But you can house hack a 2 to 4 unit property. So that's what's happened in the Milwaukee market where I started investing. As I just started selling off a few of my properties. A lot of them have gone to house hackers. There was an influx of owner occupants into that community. And they can do FHA, low money down programs. The city offers grants also for the low income first time home buyers. And now they're able to get their feet wet, right? But from my point of view, I'm selling it as a retail price, right? So I'm not selling it to an investor, right? Investors are interesting people. I just had, this portfolio of properties that I have, I've sold 5 of the 6 so far. Someone offered on them from me. And I was just looking at the other day, like I would have lost about $40,000 if I would have taken his offer. He was like, your properties, your prices are too high. They're not going to appraise. We want 40, like whatever. I think they're taking like $35,000 off. And so far they've all appraised. They've all been pretty much asking price or above. And it would have cost me tens of thousands of dollars if I would have listened to him. And he's not an appraiser. And that's why I told him, like, why would you, like, until I see a physical appraisal, I'm not dropping my price, and if you're not willing to pay that, then I will move on to someone else and someone else will pay that. That's how real estate works. So sure. On the 5+, your only options are investors.
Yeah.
And like a little while before you mentioned that you would email like your partners and let them know like why you turned down a property. So what are some of those reasons that you do turn down like potential deals?
This is gonna sound, a lot of it is gut feeling. So a lot you'll hear on any, people always tell you know your market, right? What does that mean? So I think that means different things to different people. One of the things I learned, especially with Chicago, is people talk stats. They're like, oh, well, employment growth or population growth, or when you're using that in the city of Chicago, that is completely irrelevant, right? South side versus north side versus downtown. There's individual pockets, right? Individual neighborhoods. So to look at the entire city of Chicago statistics and say that is applicable across the entire city and every neighborhood is complete bullshit. Right. So, I like to look at things at a very specific neighborhood market. And part of that, I said, is knowing your market. So when I was looking at Milwaukee, when we first went up there, we'd met with 3 different agents and we told them, hey, we're buying $500,000 of property next month. So take the day and show us what you would spend $500,000 on. I wanted to see, I left it completely open-ended to them. I wanted to see what they said and why. So it was a really interesting experience because again, you're listening to someone else explain to you why they like areas, why they don't like areas, what their experience is. So from there, we actually ended up not choosing any of those neighborhoods because they took me where all the investors are going, right? Mm-hmm. Which are, the high cap rate properties.
Yeah.
They were areas that I just personally was not comfortable. I'm a blonde girl. I visit properties by myself. While they were great numbers on paper, I was just not 100% comfortable with the tenant class or dealing with those sort of properties. And that I dodged a damn bullet with that. I'll tell you that. But we had found another area that was, the numbers were still good, but I felt safe. And one of the things I liked about the area, similar to Chicago, was it was a Hispanic community. It was bordering like just across the highway from it. It was like it's kind of like I would say Logan Square 10 years ago. But just next to it, across the highway is like it's Bayview. It's the cool area where the hipsters are, and there's like little art shops and people are drinking cocktails out of mason jars. And then the other side of the area is like the really nice ritzy suburbs. Crime is minimal. I felt very safe. Like those were all one of the reasons why I kind of picked that area. And I started off with agents working up there. So, take me out, look at properties. And then I spent about 20 minutes every day looking at every single property in the MLS. I still recommend that to anyone trying to get to know areas, is just start clicking through the pictures, right? Paying attention to what the rents are, paying attention to which ones are sitting in the market, which properties go faster, right? And over time, you won't notice it at first, but over time, after a few months, a property will come up and you're like, oh, wow, that's too expensive. Or, oh, that's a really good price. Or, oh, those rents are high. Like that's just you internalizing that information. So it got to the point after a few months where like I can walk in a property and in 5 minutes tell you what I pay for it. Simple as that. I don't negotiate. I will give you an offer, take it or leave it. That's my style. So that all just comes from, I said, walking properties, paying attention, looking at the MLS, getting to know your market. And that's really what I did. I put everything, I've got a calculator built, of course, everything goes into the calculator, but the calculator only shows you so much.
Yeah, for sure.
So, if there was a property where I thought there was a better potential and had a lower cap right now and it, potentially could be higher, I would still buy it. One of the reasons I would not buy a property, even if it hit my numbers, which I may or may not have talked about, but understand that when you're growing a portfolio, one of the things you should be looking at is what your cash on cash return is, right? Mm-hmm. So I always tell the story of I was buying this duplex. I want to say it was for like maybe $35,000, right? And it rented for $1,200 a month, right? Yeah. On paper, that is a fantastic investment, right? You're an idiot to pass up that investment. But it had structural problems, right? The basement had structural problems. It needed about $20,000 of work, which had been factored into the price. So even if we're at 35 plus 20, we're still at 55, and it brings in $1,200 a month, right? We're still talking a very good investment. I passed on it. I passed on it because that was $20,000 of capital that I would have to put into that property post-loan. So my loans are all 80% or 80% loan to value. So I'm putting 20% down on these properties. So if you look at it from that way, 20 grand to me is $100,000 of house I can't buy in the future, right? Yep. Money doesn't grow on trees. I don't have access to a flow of capital. I have a set amount to spend, and my money is better spent as putting 20% down on properties versus paying cash for them or putting large capital infusions to them. So when I looked at it from that perspective of like, hey, I can pay 55 grand for this $1,200 cash flowing property, but I could actually buy 2 properties that probably bring in, let's say, $1,000 each for that same capital infusion. Now I'm getting $2,000 a month instead. So that's a better investment for me. So understanding, how you're distributing your capital is also incredibly important.
For sure. I agree. So moving into that, you were kind of talking about how, you rather spend that finite amount of capital into multiple properties without, too much upgrading or maintenance. So what is some advice that you have for somebody who's trying to scale their portfolio to maybe be over, 50 units or just under 100, whatever it may be? What is some advice that you have for some people? Because a lot of people look at it as a very daunting task, but as long as I've been in real estate, which hasn't been a long time at all, but from my time being here, I see a lot of people kind of do it like you, where it's like, oh, I plan to buy this many, but then opportunity came and it was just as simple to buy, way more than that. So what is some advice you could offer to somebody who's new?
I think people get really, really hung up on number of units. Even Justice, one of the agents that worked to me, we had a call the other day, and he's like, well, like, what was your goal of units? I'm like, I had no goal of units. Like, what do you mean? There had to be a goal of how many units you wanted to own. I'm like, no, not at all. There was a goal of how much capital I wanted to make every month, right? And that's different. So understanding, that's how I worked my numbers, was backwards from that. So I said, I don't care if I buy one unit, like if one unit gives me $1,000 a month cash flow, right? Or I need to get 10 units that give me $100 a month cash flow, right? What's the better opportunity for me? So that can be said. People try to think of it as some sort of accomplishment, like, oh, I've got 50 doors. Like, who cares? Really, is that really important? Like, I don't understand that part of this real estate world.
Yeah.
What I understand is I bring in enough money every month to work when I want, and travel when I want. That's what's important to me, not necessarily how many doors that I have. So it's a different perspective. But the capital is definitely the hardest part. I get, questions all the time. Like, I've got 10 grand. What should I do? And my response is save more money. Like, I don't know what you want me to do with 10 grand. If that's your entire savings, right? That should be your capital reserves, not your down payment. So it's a matter of, how do you get there? And I know everyone wants to get there fast. So I've got a client who just bought, and on the north side of Chicago, he spent about $1 million in the last 12 months buying property. And now he wants to get another one. I'm like, you gotta chill, like you chill. You just signed, you just moved into his second property, and it was like 3 days after his first property owner occupied had expired. So you signed another year owner occupied, and he's already talking about looking at the next one. I'm like, just chill. Like, I know we all want to get there, right? But you don't want to force it. So it's okay to go slow. So people look at me and think, oh my God, she bought, 18 properties in 9 months. But also understand that was about 4 years into my investing. The first couple of years, I bought one property every year and a half. So it wasn't like I just started off doing that. And again, understand also that it probably cost me tens of thousands of dollars in mistakes because I did it the way that I did. It would have been a lot easier if we had bought one property a quarter over multiple years, because then we would be able to to take them over, right, and have systems and processes built.
Yeah.
I had to go back a year and a half into it and be like, crap, like I don't even really know what happened, but we've got like money flying everywhere, and you've got to get things done quick. So it's going to cost you more money, because if you would have done it at an even pace, you would have had time to plan all those things out. So It's not the best way to do it. Do I regret it? I don't know, to be honest. Part of it is what it is. But I think people just get so caught up with the number of it being like a accomplishment, like a gold star they can wear on their shoulder, on their shirt, and it's not really like that.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of how it is kind of at the beginning, because I'll be the first one to admit, I see a lot of ego in business in general, not even just real estate. And I think it kind of comes from, because I started to, develop it as well, that, I had to be the smartest guy in the room. I had to be the best negotiator, the best salesperson. I had to run my numbers the best. Everything had to be like the best. It's kind of like this competitive atmosphere. But I feel like that's when you're newer. And then when you start to mature a little bit, you start to think of it kind of from your standpoint, where it's like, what is your goal? And let's get to that goal together, as opposed to competing with each other. And like, I don't care how many units you have against how many units I have, just as long as we're both getting to where we want to be.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of glad you think of it that way, because a lot of people are, they're in a mindset where they have to be better for whatever reason. And,
I think
millennial
thing, man.
Yeah.
it might be. It might be.
That's how, I know. Like, it's gonna be funny how we all fuck up our own generation of kids. Like, no one's perfect, right? Like, we're all screwing them up in one way or another.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's that comparing yourself to other people thing. right? That's definitely said. I'm technically a millennial, but I'm on the older side of millennials. So I'm one of the hybrid ones that like we didn't have home computers really until like, maybe, like high school. But like we definitely didn't have smartphones until we were well into graduating college.
Right.
But because we didn't have social media. You know, social media, I think I got my Facebook account when I was in my 22, 23. That's when it was just coming about. So most of my forming years, 16 to 21, were not spent comparing myself to other people.
Right.
And that's definitely something that terrifies me with social media and especially like teenage girls that need to compare yourself to these, YouTube bulimic stars. Like it's just nonsense. But why? Like, why do we have that need to compare ourselves? Like, I'm not perfect, obviously, nor am I the best really at anything. I'm really good at 3 things is how I view life. And I just try to spend most of my day doing those 3 things. Everything that I'm not good at, I don't stress about it. I hire it out. I pay someone else to do it. Right. That's part of it too, is we talked earlier about being self-aware. If you're going to drive yourself absolutely nuts if you think that you can do every single aspect of this business and be the best at it. That's not true. Someone else is going to be better at you, and that's okay. Hire them, partner with them, right? Skill sets. One of the companies that I have is the Midwest Real Estate Networking Summit. It's a 2-day event coming up in June at UIC in Chicago. And it's a 2-day educational conference for real estate investors. My partner, John, on that, John Kasman, is the perfect example of this. His skill sets are so opposite mine. It's really mind blowing. I am definitely the organized, the planner, not like he's not organized or a good planner. Like he's like the ambiance person. He handles the marketing. He handles how things look, right? What's the message? And he starts talking about all this kind of stuff and it just flies right over my head. I'm like, give me the spreadsheets and let me do the accounting. But like if it's anything like that, like I will spend, an hour in PowerPoint trying to create something and I give it to him and he's like, this looks like shit. Let me redo this for you. And in 5 minutes, he makes it look a million times better than I ever could. So I don't even bother anymore. Right. Like that's a perfect idea of, right. Like I recognize that my skill set is not strong in that category and his is. So he does 100% of that stuff and I don't even touch it. And that's what works out great because we can be coexisting and complementary to each other. That's what partnerships should be about. Even if you're going to do it on your own, if you're not in a partnership, recognizing what you do well and what you don't do well, right? And stop spending your time focusing on things you don't do well. You can hire anything out pretty much these days. Now, I think where people get in trouble though is when people really over delegate. I see that a lot where they're 100% focused on systems and processes, and they just want everything to be delegated out. And if you're not paying attention to the day to day, I've seen a lot of businesses go under in that way because they just think, well, I've got someone to handle. There's 20 things that need to get done today. Everyone's got a job. It's their job. Well, if you're not paying attention though, you're not double checking their work, you're going to get yourself in trouble.
Oh, yeah, sure. Definitely. So we do want to wrap it up to respect your time. So before you go, we're Abundant Culture and you're on the Abundant Culture podcast. So we want to ask you, how do you spread abundance?
That's a good question. I think abundance is spread through knowledge, sharing with people, understanding that there is, we talk about just because you're good at something doesn't mean you have to be the best, right? And if you can elevate people around you, right, and help teach them, then they're also elevated and then they can share the wealth as well. So to me, knowledge is wealth. Learning obviously is consistent learning from people is part of the abundance as well.
Awesome. So just to wrap it up, I think that was a perfect question. This podcast has been absolutely amazing. You're a wealth of knowledge and we really appreciate having you on. But there's a lot of people that, may be interested in coming to your meetup because we didn't really get into that as much, or just may be interested in possibly, maybe buying some of your portfolio or whatever the case may be. How would somebody get in contact with you in order to speak with you about any of those matters?
Sure. The best way is probably our website, which is secondcity, SECONDCITY-RE.com.
Awesome. So,
Yep.
go ahead.
Thank you so much for
Yeah,
being
thanks
on
for
the
having me.
podcast.